This is your introduction to ratios. When you're talking about ratios, it's basically just a fancy way in math of saying that you are trying to compare items that are somewhat similar. Okay, so if I wanted to compare apples and oranges, I could count how many apples, I could count how many oranges, and then I could say that they're similar because they're both fruits, right? So in this example here, if you notice, you're comparing circles, right? Some of them are green, some of them are pink, but technically I could also add an additional comparison and say, hey, how many green circles are there to total circles? And it would make sense, right? So in general, when you look at this, it says ratios compare similar objects or units of measurement. Apples to oranges are both fruits. Stars to circles would be shapes. Boys to girls could be the fact that they're both kids, right? You could say Porsches to Corvettes, right? They're both cars. Pencils to markers. They're both writing utensils, okay? Somehow they could kind of fit in the same category. So that's what a ratio is. You're comparing similar objects, or in another way, you're comparing things that could be considered a similar unit of measurement, okay? There are 3 different ways to write a ratio in math. They're called notations. Of course, we have to put fancy, scary words to everything. But when we say, hey, what are the 3 notations when writing a ratio, we're just saying, hey, what are the 3 ways you could possibly write it? So if I wanted to compare, like for example here, we had green to pink, right? Notice how they write it. They use these little snake bites. They're called colons, right? So when I would read this, I would say 5 to 2. Or I would say 2 to 5. That's how you say it. You don't say 5:2. So that is one way that you can write a ratio with a colon. Another way is to actually use your words, right? So instead of saying A colon B, like I said, you use the word 2. I'm comparing green to orange, so I'd use the word 2. The other way to do it is to write it as a fraction. Lots of people don't like to write it as a fraction because it does get kind of confusing, but you might see it that way, okay? So if I were to write it as a fraction, and I was using this example here, where I said green to pink, right? My example would be something like this, right? I would say, oh, okay, it's 5 to 2, right? 5 green circles to 2 pink circles, and that's how you could write it. If I was doing the pink to green, I could say 2 pink circles to 5 green circles. Nothing like rocket science here, right? You're basically just counting and making sure you know the 3 different ways that you could write it as a ratio, okay? So this is also something that throws kids off. This is really the only reason why a kid might actually miss something. If you read what's in green up there at the top, greenish blue, whatever, ratios should always be simplified. You simplify a ratio just the way you would a fraction, okay? So you're dividing both of your numbers in your ratio by the same number. You're trying to simplify it or reduce it down to its lowest terms, okay? So if you look at this specific example here, you started out with the original ratio, and I would read this as 6 to 15, okay? But I know that the number 3 can evenly go into the number 6. I also know that the number 3 can evenly go into 15, right? Or I can divide them both by 3 evenly is another way of saying it, right? So if I divide them both by 3, that's how I'm going to reduce it down. And instead of saying 6 to 15, I now have it in its lowest terms, and I would say 2 to 5. The reason why you reduce things down is just because it makes it a little bit easier for you to understand, right? So if I said the ratio of girls to boys in 6th grade, this isn't true, but if the ratio of girls to boys in 6th grade was 6 to 15, what does that mean? Technically, that would mean for every 6 girls, there are 15 boys, okay? That's kind of easy to understand, but even easier would be, hey, for every 2 girls in class, there are 5 boys, right? So if I want to stick to that ratio and I decide to, let's pull more kids from the lottery, right? If you know how Remington works, we pull kids, right? So if I pull 2 more girls to add to 6th grade and I want to stick to this ratio, how many boys would I have to also pull? I would also have to pull 5 more boy names, okay? So 2 girls to 5 boys, or for every 5 boys. Cool. That is also just showing as an example down here. To simplify a ratio, divide all numbers in the ratio by the same amount. This is the exact same thing I just said, except for you're going to notice that, whoa, there are 3 numbers in this example. 8 to 12 to 4. And then they reduce that down to comparing 2 to 3 to 1. Okay, so this could be something where it's like, hey, for every 2 apples that you add, let's get away from fruit. For every 2 candy bars in the bag, you have 3 bags of chips and 1 sucker. Okay, so if you want to keep to that ratio, if I decide to add another sucker to the bag, I would have to stick to that and say, okay, now I need 3 bags of chips and 2 more candy bars. You're just sticking to the same ratio. This is really important when you're doubling a recipe or tripling a recipe. Not that Miss Newald really cooks or anything, but I do know that much at least. So if you're cooking something and you want it to stay the exact same flavor, and you decide, hey, this recipe normally just makes cookies for like 5 people. If you're having this huge party and you want to make cookies for 25 people, you have to keep to the same ratio. So you would be taking every measurement and multiplying it by 5 so that everything will taste the same in the end, even though you created more food. And in the videos that I show you on Canvas, there's actually an entire video of a bunch of kids that are cooking and they introduce ratios that way. So it's kind of a cool way to wrap your brains around it because it's real world and it makes it a little bit easier to understand. Same thing here, right? I'm just showing you a ratio of 9 to 3, right? And then we made sure to simplify the ratio or reduce it down to the lowest terms possible. So basically for every 3 rectangles, you have 1 triangle. Cool. Okay. Cheryl, that is our overall intro to what are ratios. So for right now, pause, think about it. You should be able to explain to someone what a ratio is. And you should also be able to tell them the 3 notations or the 3 ways that you can write a ratio, okay? Pause the video or stop and think about it for a second. You should be able to explain that a ratio is just a way to compare objects or units of measurement that are similar to one another, right? And that there are 3 ways to write a ratio. You can write it as a fraction, not as common, not as preferred, I guess. You can write it with a colon, those little snake bites. And you can also just write it using the word to when you're comparing them.